Tonight I'm going to discuss atheism and something that I think is really a fundamental component of omnism. Back when I was in my mid-teens, I started studying various religions. Believe it or not, at the time, I was still very conservatively Christian, very right-wing conservatively Christian. And so I still had this propensity to study other religions and other theologies and philosophies. And I read just about everything I could on other religions. I studied Islam and Judaism and Hindu and Buddhism and just about everything I could get my hands on. And of course, my conclusion at the end of all that was, well, these are all some interesting religions. They're close. I was comparing them to Christianity. I was lining up the belief systems and saying, well, in the things that they agree with Christianity, they're great. In the things they don't agree with it, well, they're obviously wrong. And something that I finally came to in my 20s, which I now consider to be sort of just an understood conclusion, and I can't believe I never understood this before, was that in order to really understand a religion, you have to actually believe it. Because otherwise, you're just studying about a religion. You're just picking up a book and reading a bunch of facts. Imagine for a moment that you were to study Catholicism. Imagine that you didn't know anything about Catholicism. You were from another planet. Who would you go to see to understand Catholicism? Would you talk to the Pope? Would you talk to a priest? Or a monk? Or a Catholic theologist? Or would you go to a parishioner? Just your average believer in the pew? Because they're all going to have a completely different view of Catholicism. They may have essentially the same beliefs, but they're going to see it differently. You talk to the Pope, and frankly I'd love to. I think Pope Francis is rather fascinating, but they're going to have a more dynamic view of Catholicism. And they're going to see it more from the political standpoint, what it's like at the top. The priest, of course, is going to look at it differently too, because he's the one who's bringing it to people. He's the one who's, well, doing all the things that a priest does, counseling people and preaching on Sunday and sort of translating the word to the parishioners. And the parishioners themselves are, of course, going to have a completely different way of looking at things because they're the actual believers. And then you go to a monk. Imagine what an hour-long conversation with Thomas Merton would have been like. I certainly wish he wasn't dead. I would love to have talked to the man. But read 5 Mile Mountain and you'll get a very different look at Catholicism from the very mystical standpoint of a Catholic monk. And there's the other thing too. When you look at a religion like that, when you try to study a religion from that point of view, all you're really doing is comparing it. You're not actually taking the religion seriously in and of itself. You're just comparing it to your own. If, on the other hand, you are able to actually bring yourself to a point where you believe in those individual religions, you see them from a completely different standpoint. And that's something I can't even begin to describe. It's just something that happens. Because in my 20s, I started studying all of these religions anew, except from the perspective of the idea that they were right, and not from the perspective of how do they relate to my religion. And I came to a completely different conclusion. But what about atheism? A belief system that doesn't even believe in God. Well, first of all, I do have some problem with the term atheism. I don't really like it. Sort of in the same way that I'm not nuts about the term pagan. Pagan really means country folk. It's sort of a Jewish term that they use for people who didn't believe what they believed, people out in the woods. Strictly translated, the word really meant something like redneck or hillbilly. So it was just a derogatory term. It was, what those people out in the backwoods believe, all that crazy stuff. So pagans kind of adopted this term, I think in some ways the same way that gays adopted queer, and they sort of made it their own, which is fine, but it sort of annoys me that it really was a derogatory term for them. And that's the same thing with atheist. Atheist was something that Christians used to call people who didn't believe in God. Oh, those are horrible people, they're atheists. And of course, those people eventually started taking some pride in it. Well, we're atheists. The problem with it is that it's also kind of an absurdity. Atheism is kind of like coming to a guy and saying, hey man, what kind of car do you like? Well, I hate Fords. Oh, it's great, but what kind of car do you like? Well, I absolutely hate Fords. I would never drive a Ford. They're just terrible, awful, horrible cars. If you define your belief system by what you don't believe in, it doesn't really say anything. I mean, if you tell me you're a humanist, well, that's something I can wrap my head around. Neil deGrasse Tyson had a great answer, and oddly enough, it was kind of similar to my view on atheism. Someone asked him if he was an atheist, and he said, I don't get into that stuff. Because to me, it's like saying, what kind of sport do you play? And answering, I don't like golf. And that's really kind of the way I feel more atheists should be. Of course, atheists believe what they believe. But to me, atheism should more be about what you're about, not what you're not about. After all, they have their own full system of beliefs and their own ethics, their own morality, their own way of looking at the world through this very particular viewpoint, which shouldn't be simply defined by, I don't believe in God. But I'm also often asked, how do you do that? How do you bring atheism into the fold, so to speak, in omnism? How do you include a belief system that doesn't believe in God? Well, for me, it kind of comes down to the as above, so below concept, or the algebraic equation of what must be true on one side must also be true on the other. In this case, if we assume that God exists, and atheism must be correct in the fact that God doesn't exist, then it must be true that atheists do essentially believe in God. Now, this is just one side of the equation. I came to this conclusion a long time ago because I thought, when you really think about it, atheists do believe in God. God, at least the way most religions seem to depict he, she, it, whatever, is the creator of all reality. Literally every speck of reality either is created by God or is God, depending on how you want to take that in more of a pantheistic, panentheistic, deistic, however you want to look at that. Everything is God. It either is God or it is the direct emanation of God. Therefore, you can really just look at atheists as being people who simply believe in God in a very particular way. They believe in what they can directly experience as much as one can directly experience something through the five senses. Of course, we know there's really more than five, but through all of those senses, going through the brain, they believe in that. They believe in reality. And if you believe in reality, you believe in God. Now, that was, to me, a pretty interesting conclusion. That was a way of explaining why atheists do believe in God. But the problem with that is the other side of the equation has to be true. If atheists do actually believe in God, then people who do believe in God must also not believe in God. Now, that's a little harder to wrap our mind around. But again, it's really just all how you look at it. Assuming for a moment that we have this existence, and by existence, I'm almost using a term that's even bigger than the universe, because I literally mean everything, the universe and all the possibilities and probabilities and perhaps multiverses, other universes, other dimensions, everything, all of existence, all in one. Assuming that that exists, which, well, let's go that far for the moment here, it is what it is. And that is something that none of us, at least as far as we know for the moment, can experience. So we experience it as much as we can, and we come up with these terms like God to explain something and put a label on something that we really can't comprehend. So when you think about it from that perspective, Christians and Muslims and Buddhists and Hindus and all of us, regardless of the fact that, of course, some of those don't actually believe in God in a Christian, Hindu way, But the point is that all of us look at this existence in their own way and translate it. And because that translation is a translation of something that's completely beyond our imagination, it all comes kind of back to zero. If you're looking sort of at a bird's eye view down on atheism and Hinduism and Christianity and Buddhism, they're all really the same thing. They're all doing the same thing. You can just as easily say Christians don't believe in God as you can say that atheists do believe in God. Because Christians are anthropomorphizing this concept they can't really wrap their head around. Atheists are, well, for lack of a better term, de-anthropomorphizing this concept they can't wrap their head around. And they are deciding to only believe in what they can experience in a very particular way, in what a lot of us would call a scientific way. So when you think about it, that's just atheism. So we all believe something, and we all actually have what I've come to find are really some pretty sophisticated systems of belief, regardless of how shallow they may seem on the outside. I know that Christians will often look at atheists and think, oh, well, they don't believe anything. But of course, anyone who's studied humanism or even existentialism or anything connected with it, all of that does believe something. I'm in many ways an existentialist myself, and I find a great deal of understanding and knowledge in those concepts that they believe, even though I don't think I would ever consider myself an atheist. In fact, if anything, if there were any of those terms I might go by, it would probably have to be agnostic. And, I actually have a certain amount of, respect for anyone, especially any man, who will admit he doesn't know. I don't know. But I am the Urban Omnist. I'll see you guys later. And guys, please don't forget to support us as much as possible by clicking subscribe, liking us on Facebook and Twitter, and please, 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 please send me those questions right at this address. Thank you very much. Again, I'm the Urban Omnist.